I just want to start out by welcoming everybody. Thank you for joining us for this educational forum. My name is Adrienne Esposito. I'm the Executive Director of Citizens Campaign for the Environment. My co-host today is Julie Tai, who's the Executive Director of the New York League of Conservation Voters, who's just now appearing like magic on your screen. Just a couple of small details. One is, as this presentation goes along, kindly put all of your questions in the Q&A box there, and we absolutely will have time to get to many. I don't know about all, but many of the questions and answers about this project. Just want you to know that traditionally, the League and CCE have partnered on doing lots of educational events on renewable energy infrastructure throughout New York State. We've done multiple events on offshore wind and the different aspects and different environmental research being done on that. So this is our first one on the potential of hydropower in New York State. And we thought it would be a good way for the proposers of the project to talk directly to the public about what this may mean. As you know, New York State is a leader in transitioning away from dirty fossil fuels to clean, safe, renewable energy. And we have a timeline to do that. We have a lot of work ahead of us. We need to have different tools in the toolbox to achieve our goal, and we're on our way. So the purpose of today is for you to have a better understanding of the role that this project or other projects dealing with hydropower may or may not play here in New York State. Before I pass it to Julie, I just want to introduce the two speakers we have with us today who will talk to you about this project. Gary Sutherland, who has a very long title. It's the Director of Strategic Affairs and Community Relations for the Northeast market from Hydro-Québec. Are you coming to us from Quebec today, Gary?
I am actually. I am up in just north of Montreal, actually, in the mountains.
Okay. All right. Well, no need to brag. Also with him today, we have Donald Jasome, who's the CEO of TDI. Donald, do you want to just say hello before we pass it to Julie?
Good morning, everyone.
Thank you, Donald. Okay. Julie Tai, Executive Director of New York League of Conservation Voters.
Hi, I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and to my colleague Adrienne. We are partnering on many of these, as she noted, and on many other topics as well. We like to use our perch to help educate, engage, and empower New Yorkers to be good advocates for the environment. And that means needing to hear from proponents such as Gary and Donald about what they're thinking about. You know, as Adrienne mentioned, the state has made a commitment to move off fossil fuels. Right now, the downstate grid is about 70% based on fossil fuels, whereas the upstate grid is about 90% clean power, which is a lot of hydro. Actually is the majority of where we get the upstate grid's clean power. So this is something that the state of New York has recognized and is proposing to find a way to bring clean power to the New York City region through a program called Tier 4. And there are many projects that are been proposed for that. And we're hoping that NYSERDA will maximize how many projects they approve so that we can accelerate how quickly we can meet our clean energy goals. So we're glad to be here today to help educate folks about this particular project.
Great, thank you. And as Julie pointed out, hydropower is not new to New York. It is used abundantly in upstate New York. And obviously it's not used downstate in the New York City or the Long Island market or even Westchester. So I'm going to turn it over now to Gary. And Gary, I think you want to share your screen.
I will, thank you. So if you just bear with me for a second and I will get that up for you. Technology being what it is, of course, it's always fun to try and do that, but hopefully we will have gotten that mastered. So you should be able to see my screen now. I hope that's the case.
Nope.
No.
Nope.
Oh, okay, there it is, Gary. Just popped up. Okay, perfect. Very good. Thank you.
Good, good. So we're going to be talking to you today about the Champlain Hudson Power Express project, bringing clean power from Quebec right down into New York City. And really, really quickly, what I wanted to do to start off is just kind of explain where we got, how we got here. This is something that I'm sure everybody in this room has seen, this virtual room, of course. This is the framework that we're working under, of course. This is the CLCPA. And to highlight a couple of these things, so we got the really fast and furious goal coming up in 2030. So I was looking at that thinking, this is only 8.5 years away now. 70% renewable energy by 2030. But then, of course, the following steps, 100% zero emissions electricity by 2040. And some really fabulous and very ambitious goals for build outs of solar, battery, offshore wind. Even very recently, some great announcements. I saw something yesterday, I think about 3,000 megawatts of solar that is on its way into New York. So this massive build out, and this is the framework and the context that we're working in. So super exciting time for us to be working in New York. A lot of people kind of wonder, so to get to that 70 by 2030 goal, what do we have out there? What is contracted? What is going to be constructed in future years? And what's remaining? So we went and looked in NYSERDA CES white paper from last year. And just to kind of highlight that, there is a close to 25 terawatt hour gap that is involved in this. So this is energy that we really don't have pinned down yet. These are not contracted or new procurements. This is not the offshore wind that we've been talking about or the solar. So this is kind of where we fit into this whole puzzle. And that's the type of area that we're working in. Now, this is something I think that everybody in this call has seen in one shape or form too, just to kind of highlight what Julie was saying earlier about the upstate versus downstate situation. So we're doing really well upstate, 90% clean energy. Downstate is really the challenge. And of course, much more of a challenge now. And since Indian Point closed, because we're pretty close or maybe even over 90% electricity generation from fossil fuels.
Gary, can you just maybe explain to people what you mean by Indian Point closing? They might not have a context
Sure.
for that.
Definitely. So Indian Point nuclear generating station, so about 40 odd miles outside of New York City, has been kind of successively closed in 2 different phases, the last one being in April of this year. So that was the largest source of low emissions power downstate in downstate New York. So what you see here, the 77% fossil fuel in New York City or in the downstate region actually reflects the fact that there was still a little bit of generation from Indian Point in the region. That is no longer there. So these are the figures from end of 2020. That figure has, of course, gone up since then. And, so this whole situation, really, that's the challenge, right? Is how do you get that energy from upstate towards downstate? When you've got in the middle of the screen, you can see this yellow area. So that's a constrained portion of the transmission grid. So it's a little bit like, I think everybody in the room can really identify where on the highway that traffic always really slows down during rush hour. So that's the equivalent really on the transmission grid. We can't get power from further upstate down into that, that region further south. So Quebec Hydropower is in the same boat really as any generator that is north or west of that transmission kind of constraint. So although we exported close to 8 terawatt hours into New York last year, all of that was delivered upstate. It's about 5% of New York State's entire electricity consumption needs in a year, and it's about 20% of the current renewable energy portfolio that New York State has. But once again, it's not getting to the right part of the state. It has to get further south, and that's the same thing for any upstate generator, really. So that's the situation that we're working in, and the state has come up with some really great possible solutions for this. So the big one is an addition of a tier 4 in the state's clean energy standard, which was done last year. And the real objective of this is to bring more renewable energy into downstate New York, into what we call New York ISO Zone J from an electrical point of view, which is really what we're trying to decarbonize. That's the decarbonization challenge that New York faces. So Tier 4 was launched right at the beginning of the year, and bids were due in May. Hydro-Québec alongside transmission developers, so Don Jessam on this call, who will speak to you a little bit more about the project details in a couple of minutes. We bid into this RFP. looking for a selection of projects sometime in Q3 of this year. So, you know, we're getting close. Hasn't happened yet, but we're getting close. And then by December 15th, NYSERDA will be filing an implementation plan for stakeholder comment and public service commission approval. So you're going to be seeing a lot of movement in this file in the next couple of months, and a chance for people to look at what that initial selection was and to be able to comment and ask questions on that. What did NYSERDA get from its RFP? Well, in the second, there was kind of a couple of different stages of this, but let's talk about the May stage, when the real bids were put in. There were 7 different proposers, 7 projects, but 35 alternative configurations. So each of us, including Hydro-Québec and TDI, we put in these proposals, but we also said, well, these are options, various different options that you can include depending on what your focus is and you know, how you want this to be done. This whole thing represents over 35 terawatt hours of renewable energy per year. Terawatt hours, it's kind of a difficult concept to get your head around, but think about all of New York State. Its electricity needs for an entire year is about 155 terawatt hours. So this is a significant portion of energy that we're talking about here. Of course, not all of those 35 terawatt hours are going to be selected, right? There was 7,500 megawatts of new renewable transmission capacity that was involved in all of these options. But it's just to say that there are a lot of good projects out there. There are a lot of possibilities for New York. And we hope that the best will win, basically. So coming back to the source of energy before we talk about Champlain Hudson per se, because of course the title of this seminar today, this webinar, is Hydropower in New York. So this is a map of Hydro-Québec system. And just to kind of comment, the blue dots that you can see on your screen are our major generating sources. So these are hydropower generating stations that are really located all across Quebec. Well, at least across the bottom half of Quebec. My map doesn't go all the way up to our northernmost point, which is about, once again, the same distance above your screen. We have in total 37,000 megawatts of generating capacity. Put that into perspective from a New York point of view, New York has somewhere around 48,000 megawatts of generating potential, all different technologies put in there. We have 37,000 megawatts of installed hydro capacity, and we also have a whole lot of wind and some other things on our system. So another 10,000 megawatts that we have under contract. Coming back to the map, so your blue dots are your generating stations. Those blue dots get their energy down to the places where we're using it. And in Quebec, that's mainly in the south. About 80% of our population lives really, really close to the US border, in about a band of 50, 60 miles from the border going north. So we're bringing all this energy down from these generating stations through our transmission grid. Our transmission grid has about 20,000 miles of high voltage transmission lines. So we're going over a very large territory to bring that down into the south and then further south into US markets in New York and New England. Another really important highlight on our network is this line. This is a direct current line that was built about 30 years ago, a little over 30 years ago actually now, that brings energy from our La Grande region, which is one of our major power generating sources, all the way down to Boston. So we feed into the Boston load pocket day in, day out. We have now for a little over 30 years. It's a 2,000 megawatt line. It's a big source of energy for New England. But once again, it was built over 30 years ago. And that is the last transmission line that was built between Quebec and the US Northeast markets. So while during that portion of time, we've been building up our generating capacity. So we brought a little more than 5,000 new megawatts of hydropower generation onto our system. We haven't built the corresponding transmission assets. So we have more power than we had yesterday, but we don't have a way yet to get it down into the markets that need it. So New York being one of those. I'm going to pass this over to Dawn now to talk to you a little bit about the project per se, and I'm going to come back right at the end, and we're both going to be available for answering questions. Dawn.
Thank you, Gary, and thank you for being here being able to speak today and talk a little bit about our Champlain Hudson Power Express project. As Gary has pointed out, Hydro-Québec has been developing over the last 10 to 15 years new generation resources and hasn't built the transmission takeaway capacity from Quebec to the major load centers. And so we started developing a project just over a decade ago called the Champlain Hudson Power Express project. It's a 1,250 megawatt fully buried HVDC or high voltage direct current transmission project. And hopefully you can see me, but we have two cables that are physically this size that are going to traverse approximately about 60% in waterways and 40% underground along rights of way that already exist. So Lake Champlain, we come down to Lake Champlain for approximately 100 miles. We then go on the CP Railroad right of way. At or about Schenectady, we switch over to the CSX right of way, down the Hudson River, come out for about 4 or 5 miles in Rockland, and then down into Astoria, where we interconnect with the NYPA Astoria complex and the Con Ed transmission grid. We'll be able to deliver about 10.4 terawatt hours of clean energy a year, and that's enough to power over 1 million homes a year, just to kind of put it in perspective. 339 miles from the Canadian border to Astoria, where we interconnect with the Con Ed grid. Gary will talk a little bit about the Quebec portion of the transmission line when he gets back on. We're targeting to be in service by the end of 2025, and this technology, we expect it to last 60 plus years, and probably much longer, because there's lots of examples of transmission lines similar to ours that are all over the world that are 60 plus years and have been in service for, as I said, decades and decades. Our supply source primarily is from Hydro-Québec, but we do also have an in-state solar supply. So we have a converter station just outside of Albany. It's at the New Scotland interconnection point, where we would connect into the grid at New Scotland. So that's an additional 500 megawatts of capacity that can collect in-state generation. And as part of our response to the Tier 4 REC program, we have an offer to supply 500 megawatts of solar power at our New Scotland location. And to put it in perspective, the construction ready project is, meets obviously New York's immediate energy needs, but replaces approximately about 50% of the endpoint generation that Gary had talked about earlier. We're a merchant transmission project, so that means we have to go out and find customers, and our customers today are the Hydro-Québec and the in-state solar renewable projects that I just talked about, that we just offered through Hydro-Québec into the Tier 4 REC program. We're fully permitted, so that makes us somewhat unique in New York, in that we have our state Article 7 siting permit. We have our presidential permit, which is required because we cross an international border, and then Army Corps permits primarily for the use of the waterways that we're going to traverse. I'll talk a little bit more about this, but over the last decade, we've done a lot of work gathering support for the project, and whether that's with environmental groups, with the unions, the business community, and our host communities, we've worked all 339 miles to garner that support. And one of the, I guess, classic ways of evidencing that is our strong local support with the 36 municipalities passing resolutions of support for the project. Environmental and economic benefits and energy resiliency. The project itself will reduce carbon emissions in New York by approximately 3.9 million metric tons per year, and other harmful pollutants at the very local level, which I'll talk a little bit more about. And this is all buried infrastructure, just to be clear. This is all buried, so this is what we would call hardened infrastructure, and the resiliency and reliability of the transmission project is based on both the technology and the fact that it's all buried technology. Gary, thank you. Sort of key benefits of the CHP project to New York. It's going to be one of the largest private investments in New York State's history. Just to put it in perspective, over the first 25 years, there'll be about $3.5 billion in direct New York expenditures. There'll be 1.4 billion in new property taxes paid by the project over to 150 communities over the first 25 years. We've established two very important funds, $40 million Green Energy Fund, which we'll talk a little bit more about in this presentation. But way back in 2003, we also established through our Article 7 process, 2013, we established a $117 million enhancement, restoration, and research habitat improvement trust fund. And these are for the waterways that we traverse. So this is talking Lake Champlain, the Hudson River, Harlem, East River. And so there's a trust fund that's been established as part of this project. As I had mentioned earlier, 10.4 terawatt hours of baseload power that can replace approximately half of Indian Point's generation. On the labor side, we're looking at over 1,400 new organized labor construction jobs for New Yorkers, and we have strong labor support. And then Gary will talk a little bit more about this, but it's always important to mention the fact that although the Tier 4 REC program is 25 years, this transmission line is going to be around for much longer than 25 years, which is going to be able to interconnect New York State with Hydro-Quebec's reservoir system, which is acting like as the largest battery for seasonal storage in North America, if not the world. So just a great legacy transmission project. Just on the labor and the job creation, these are three editorials that were issued about this time last year by the IBEW, the Operating Engineers, and the Laborers Union. Obviously, the font is a little small to read on these slides, but it basically is talking about the fact that there's great jobs that are going to be created, great union jobs created during the construction of this project, that the men and women of all of these unions are anxious to get back to work. Obviously, with COVID and the slowdown, getting shovel-ready projects off the ground is really important. And these unions, we've been working with them for many, many years, and they're one of our most important partners in the development of our project. I had mentioned the local pollutants, and so just wanted to talk a little bit about the environmental and social justice associated with bringing that clean energy from Hydro-Québec, the hydropower and the solar power from upstate, injecting it right into Astoria, which is predominantly a community that has had to host a lot of the thermal generation from an historical perspective. And so what this does, this gives the clean energy alternative to in-city fossil fuel burning power plants. And one of the things that we had our consultants have a look at is not only the CO2 benefits of the project, but also what are the very localized reductions in the pollutants. And that's NOx and SOx, particulate matter, and it's significant. Approximately half of the benefits of this project on those very localized pollutants are going to occur in New York City. And it's about a 50% reduction, which is just a very significant amount of reduction in these local pollutants. And this has both an improvement in air quality. So when you think of NOx, you think of smog, and all of these pollutants obviously also have health effects associated with them. So, you know, our consultants have looked at this, and both from a health and economic value in these local areas, it's a significant benefit to the community that we're going to be interconnecting with. The Green Energy Fund. So let me tell you a little bit about the Green Energy Fund that we've established. So this is a $40 million fund that's co-sponsored by TDI and Hydro-Québec. It's a 20-year funding stream over the first 20 years of the life of the project. It's predominantly green jobs training fund, and that's what that's been established. Support residents living in disadvantaged and frontline communities, and this is across the entire line. But you know, certainly the larger communities affected by this project is right into the New York City area. So there's there's benefits across the entire line, but also very focused on New York City. We've developed it in close consultation with the local workforce, experts, union laborers, housing authorities, other NGOs. So this has been in the works for about a year, and we've been working with all of these different constituencies to develop the program to be as effective and efficient as possible. And it serves the needs of communities along the entire route, as I had mentioned. And this is just one quote. We had a press release on this project, I'd say about a month or so ago now. It's on our website, so certainly you can download all of the different quotes. But just, talking about the fact that, we've been working with these different constituencies trying to develop this program to be as effective as possible. I talked about the resiliency and the hardened infrastructure, and we don't have to think back very long. Last summer, California experienced some very serious rolling blackouts, and it was a combination of many factors, including the fact that they didn't have the backup firm supply that you need in order to integrate as many renewable energy projects, which tend to be intermittent in nature. One of the, the key differentiators between hydro and other renewable energy sources such as wind and solar is hydro tends to not be intermittent. It is 24/7, 365 type of technology. And, one of the areas where, if you don't have that baseload generation, which traditionally in New York City has been Indian Point, if you don't get baseload generation like the project that we're talking about here, the CHPE project backed up by Hydro-Quebec's reservoirs, where all of that baseload generation is going to come from is gas and oil. And so it's really important to get a project like this integrated into the city's grid. But on top of that, because of the fact that it's all buried, it has the benefit of the hydropower is distance from the city. So any sort of storm or a sandy type of storm isn't going to affect both the generation supply and the load at the same time. So you've got the geographical diversity. And then on top of that, you have the benefit of Hydro-Quebec's supply being around the clock 24/7. And then the CHPE project being all buried is less susceptible to outages due to storms. So we think that's a really great combination, and the California experience, which is not that distant at this point in time, we're only talking a year ago, you can certainly see the benefits of a project like this integrating into the city's transmission grid.
Don, before you move on, I'm getting some questions just personally text to me. One person's asking, and it pertains to this slide, so that's why I wanted to interrupt you. What happens if there's some type of drought or reduction of water in Quebec? Will that interfere with the flow or the power generated to New York City?
So Gary, do you want to field that first, and then I can supplement?
Sure. So we have a system that is basically very, very close to being 100% hydro-based here in Quebec. If you look at any kind of given time of what is on our grid in terms of energy, we've got 99.6% clean energy, and that's coming majoritarily from hydro and a little bit from wind. So the whole question of water, how much of it do we get, where it falls is a really central one for Quebec. Now, any of you who has been in Quebec, you know that we don't have the nicest winters. They're cold, they're very, very snowy, long. Yeah, there's a whole lot of superlatives that we can kind of add here. 80% of our population actually heats with electricity. So there's very little maneuvering room for that system to have any problem, especially in winter. So we have a system of reservoirs. There are 27, 28 big reservoirs, and then a series of smaller reservoirs that we really manage on a multi-year or a multi-annual basis. Some of those are reservoirs that we kind of look a 3-year perspective, others are 5 years out. And because our reservoirs are all over Quebec, they're really located in different types of regions. So this summer, I would love to be able to say that I knew what weather was like in New York, but we can't get across the border yet, so I don't know. We had a little bit of a drought in southern Quebec, which meant that on some of the, the lakes and the rivers that people use for navigation, they're getting their boats out and whatnot, there wasn't a whole lot of water. Well, that's not at all the situation that we've had in the north, where we have our major reservoirs. So the territory is so big, we're 2.5 times the size of Texas, that we can really get that kind of regional distribution of water that you would see on a very, very large portion of the US. So if I took Quebec and I actually pinned it right on top of the map of the United States, you would see that our territory is pretty much all the way from the Canadian-US border all the way down to Florida. So it's a really, really big territory, which means that we get that distribution of precipitation all across the province. And because this is such an important thing for us to make sure that we've always got that resource available, we've done a lot of projection work in terms of what climate change is going to mean for the amount of water that we get on our territory. And climate change, we're seeing these zones of climatic zones that are basically moving upward, right? So what that work has given is that we're looking at about 8% more water in the regions where we generate a lot of our power. So a very, 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 very long answer really for one question, but to basically give you an idea that this is a central thing for us. It's something that we look at a lot. We don't have the power going off here in Quebec, and we're very, very confident that we're going to be able to meet all of these commitments with long-term contracts, including New York.
Okay, thank you. I didn't mean to derail you. That's one of the central questions we get with wind, and I think it's an important question, about wind being intermittent, and I think it's an important question to be answered about hydro, so thank you. Please continue, Don. I didn't want to derail you, as I said.
Yeah, well, with this slide, I think I'm handing the baton back to Gary, who's going to talk a little bit more about the Quebec system and how it's going to interconnect to the CHPE project.
Sure, and maybe one more thing, just on the question of water, because it is a really important issue, and it's a great question to bring up. In our reservoir system, we have, it was on one of my slides before, but I kind of skipped over it. We have a reservoir storage potential of 177 terawatt hours. So once again, New York is about 155 terawatt hours of total electricity consumption in an entire year. Basically, what does that mean? It means that with the reservoir system that we have today, without one more drop of precipitation or any more snow, and we get a lot of snow during the year that ends up in our reservoirs, we could actually meet the electricity needs of the entire state of New York for an entire year. That's how big our system is. I would love to be able to take all of you up to some of our reservoirs, because it's impressive to see the amount of water. I mean, Quebec is a territory that has about 22% of its actual surface area that's covered in water. So it was a little bit natural for us to go towards hydropower as a generating source. I wanted to come back really, really quickly to this map that Don used a little bit earlier. So he showed you the New York portion of the line. There is a corresponding portion of the line in Quebec. Our actual grid now does not go all the way down to the US-Canada border. So we do have to build about 37 miles of underground transmission line to be able to hook up with the CHPE line on the New York side of the border. So we're in the process, of course, of looking at that on our side. One of the really interesting developments, though, that we have seen really, really recently is that we have established a partnership with an Indigenous community that is located in the area where this line is going to go. It's the Mohawk Council of Ganawage. And just actually last month, we signed an MOU with them. They will become a joint owner of this transmission line once it's built. And for their community, this is really securing many, many years of economic benefits that are associated with this line. So it's a first for us. We had never done this type of a partnership with an Indigenous community on a transmission line. So we're really excited about that. And it's kind of, it heralds a new chapter in our relationships with Indigenous communities. We work with a lot of Indigenous communities. There are 11 nations in Quebec and 55 different communities, many of whom are located close to either our generation resources or our transmission resources. We have about 40 different agreements that are in place with those communities that look at impacts and advantages for the communities, a whole lot of different things. It can look at fish species, it can look at how the river is used, many different things. But this is a new type of relationship with an Indigenous community where they're coming with an equity partnership for one of our assets. So really great turn of events, and we're looking forward to kind of looking at more of these types of agreements as we move forward in time. One of the things that I kind of wanted to bring up on the hydropower side as well is a comparison of greenhouse gas emissions that are coming from different types of technologies. So, quite often we talk about renewable technologies, wind and solar, hydro. We talk about nuclear as being a low carbon source. What you see here in front of you is a life cycle analysis. So this was done by a life cycle analysis chair in the University of Montreal. And what we asked them to do was look at how much in terms of greenhouse gases is emitted per kilowatt hour that is generated by different types of energy sources. And you have the results in front of you. You have wind, nuclear, solar, you've got the thermal technologies, and you've got Quebec hydropower, which is a really important thing to take into mind. Our emissions profile here is not going to be the same as one that you would find, say, in the southern US, even more different than what you would find in a tropical region, just because of the type of terrain that we're working on. That really determines how much greenhouse gas is actually emitted into the atmosphere. It's what kind of organic matter you're working with, and are there a lot of trees? Is there a huge growth span? And once again, Adrian pointed out how long our winters are. That means that our forests really don't grow that fast. So interesting, as we look kind of towards decarbonizing different regions, there's a couple of things that we can conclusions that we can kind of make. So first of all, I think we're going to be more and more focusing on a smaller subset of technologies. We're going to have to move away from oil, coal, of course, and even natural gas, and really come and focus on these different technologies that we see here and battery storage. Well, first of all, these technologies are not all the same. So some of them have continuous output. As Dawn mentioned, our hydropower, we can modulate it during the day when demand changes and fluctuates. It's always producing because we have reservoir hydro. So we're basically storing that energy for the time that we need it. Nuclear is the same way. It's continuously outputting, whereas wind and solar, great technologies, are intermittent. They're variable. So we're depending on whether or not the wind is blowing and the sun is shining. So somehow, as we decarbonize, we're going to have to take these technologies that we have and mix and match them until we get the right sort of mix, really, that is going to be pertinent to any one region. And so I think that's really the challenge that we're looking at as we're moving forward and thinking about how the energy sector is going to evolve. So we think about this a lot on the Hydro-Québec side, because traditionally we've really been an energy supplier to your market. We send big volumes of energy from Quebec into New York, from Quebec into New England. And, we can store about a year of New York's electricity consumption. We have that flexibility in our reservoir system to be able to really respond to your demand when it's happening. But there's other things that we can do with our reservoir system as well. And so we talk a lot about being kind of the battery of the Northeast. So what does this mean? This means that, coming back to that, one of those initial slides that we were looking at, 9,000 megawatts of wind, 6,000 megawatts of solar that are going to be built in New York State. Well, it's great when those are actually working and they're furnishing your energy needs. What happens when the wind dies down or the sun's not out? Well, we can jump in and we will have this line, as Dawn said, going way past the contract period that we're looking at with NYSERDA. It'll be available so that we can really balance out your wind and solar resources. And the flip side is true too. There are going to be times when your wind and solar resources are really generating more than you need. So there's no reason that we couldn't pull that energy up to Quebec, absorb that surplus, use it for the Quebec market. While we're doing that, we're not using our hydropower. So we turn off our turbine generators and our water levels go up, and we're effectively storing energy in the form of water in our reservoirs at that time. And that energy can be sent back to New York at a time when you're going to need more renewable energy. So one of the things that we talk about a lot as we're moving through the decarbonization sequence and bringing more variable resources like wind and solar on board is, what is that variability going to look like? And there's going to be variability over a day, but there's also going to be variability over seasons. Maybe you're going to get more generation in, say, spring and fall than you're going to get in summer. You know, those hot days in New York City when your air conditioning is cranked up all the way, quite often you're not getting a whole lot of wind. You're probably looking to get a whole lot of wind. You'd love that, but you're not getting it. So we're looking on a much wider regional basis of how we can make those types of energies kind of work together and fit together properly. And that's why it's so important that we do get additional transmission capacity between our two regions, because without that, we're not going to be able to perform that role as we move forward. And on that point, I'd just like to highlight, if anybody's looking for further reading this afternoon, MIT did a really great study that was put out last year in 2020 called Two-Way Trade in Green Electrons, and it really talks to this point. How can we move from a situation where Quebec is supplying a large amount of energy to neighboring markets to one where we're really working together, sometimes supplying, but sometimes taking your energy and really sharing those resources over a much wider geographical base. Questions? I think we've gotten to that point.
Okay, great. Thank you so much to both Gary and to Don. We appreciate your time and sharing your expertise. I learned actually a lot about this project, so this is very, very helpful. One question that was also sent to me, since people seem to be shy about putting them in the Q&A, but I got an email, is if you could speak to, I mean, one of the controversial things about your project is, you know, its impact into the Hudson River. Can you speak to how this, you know, line will be dealt with regard to being sensitive to the Hudson River?
Sure. So let me start with the regulatory process first. So as I had mentioned earlier, we went through state siting. We went through 2 federal permits as well, the presidential permit and the Army Corps of Engineers. And all of those permits, I would say 99% of them are environmental in nature in terms of, you know, how is this project going to impact the environment that it's going to be run through. So there are multiple studies that have been done on the project in terms of its minimal impact during the construction. But, you know, the design that we originally came up with and the design that came out at the end of the regulatory process is different. There were multiple stakeholders at the state, NGO, different government levels that had a lot of input as to how the project was going to actually be designed, how, you know, the speed at which we were going to be installing in the Hudson River, the turbidity in the Hudson River when we were installing the cables, the time of the year that we're installing the cables, the fish life, the flora, the fauna. So there was extensive consultation and state and federal oversight as to how the project was actually going to be built. And, you know, we worked with many different organizations, including different environmental organizations, to come up with a design that everyone who signed off on the project's design was satisfied that would meet both the long-term benefits of reducing CO2, but also taking into account all of the you know, minimal impacts during the construction phase, particularly in the waterways that we traverse. And, you know, just as a classic example, Hydropower Bay is a particularly sensitive area for fish spawning. And, you know, we originally were planning on going through the bay, and, you know, we ended up having to come out of the bay and through Rockland County instead, because it literally is bank to bank a fish habitat area for spawning fish, and it just was not possible to be able to have the cables in that particular area. So a lot of very careful design, I will say, that both at the state and federal level, particularly at the state level, we literally went foot by foot, mile by mile in the design, and making sure that it was adhering to all the state rules, but more importantly, to have all the stakeholder input into the design of the final project.
Okay, thank you. Another question in the chat from Marcia. Will this project expand to include other states? Do you have a plan for that? And is there a time frame? And she totally understands if this is proprietary information as well.
Well, I would say originally, way back just over a decade ago, we actually had planned on interconnecting both into New York City and over into Connecticut. We dropped the Connecticut portion of the line. It just didn't make sense after a lot more development. So that was the original design. At this moment in time, I can tell you there is no plan to expand beyond what we have already done. So this project, when we started, was 1,000 megawatts into New York City. The technology has actually changed such that the cable size hasn't changed at all, and we can actually get 25% more through those cables. And so we went from 1,000 to 1,250. We just went through an amendment with the Public Service Commission, and the Public Service Commission approved the uprating of the transmission line. So that has been the major amendment of the project, but no thoughts today of interconnecting to other states or locations.
Okay, and just for our listeners, 1,250 megawatts translates to roughly how many homes?
It's just over 1 million residential homes is kind of the rule of thumb.
Okay, great. Julie, do you have any questions? Anybody texting and emailing you?
No, actually no one is emailing, texting me in this particular.
I'm going to give them all your email address. Okay, so if you guys want to make any last comments, we can wrap up. I just want to say to the participants, I hope you found this useful. I hope you found it informative. This is, a project that is, I think, unique. Obviously, as we said when we first started out, we have lots of hydropower in upstate New York. We have zero hydropower in downstate New York. And at this point, I'll speak from my organization's perspective, CC, is that we need to look at all our options. We are in a climate crisis. We do need to transition away from fossil fuels, and we need to look at the various options and technologies and green energy that are available to us. Gary, any last parting words?
I'd love to echo that, Adrian. I think you said that really, really well. This is a huge emergency, and I think we have to throw everything at it that we can. We're going to be moving through some really interesting times ahead of us. I look at this offshore wind objective of 9,000 megawatts. There's really only one offshore wind on the entire US eastern seaboard that's operating today. It's about 40 megawatts, I believe. So we're going as fast as we can, I think, collectively to get to something that is very, very different than what it looks like today. But I think we shouldn't forget that there are things like hydropower that are a part of your energy mix today. Hydro-Québec, and Quebec in general has been furnishing hydropower into New York State for over 100 years now. So it's not new. But I think we can do much more, and we have to be maybe more innovative and creative about the way that we use it and getting that power to where it has to get. Upstate is doing really well, but downstate needs it now. And so it's really the time. We've been talking about transmission constraints in New York since I started working in the electricity sector, and I don't want to tell you how long that's been. But I think it's time now to move to something new, and that's what the decarbonization and the energy transition is pushing us towards, is a little bit thinking out of the box and bringing regions together, because we don't have the same resources, and we have to make sure that we're pooling those resources in the best possible way. Right. So thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. It was great. Great seeing you again. Great talking to everybody, and looking forward to the next steps.
Gary and Don, I'll readily admit, I had no idea that there were 2,000 megawatts of Hydro-Québec hydropower going into the Boston market for over the last 30 years. So that, is, I think, important and valuable information. Julie, you want to get the last word?
Sure. So I thank you for joining us today, to all of our audience participants. Thank you to Gary and for Donald for talking about the project that you're proposing. And we're all very excited to see what projects NYSERDA chooses for Tier 4. We're hoping that they choose multiple so that we can help accelerate the moving to a cleaner grid as we move forward, since, as you mentioned, we are in this climate emergency. So I spent my morning listening to the daily covering why Portland was so hot this summer. And we really do have an emergency that we need to be acting on with haste. So having information about projects like yours, I think, is really informative to the public. And we're hoping that we see decisions from NYSERDA timely so that we can see what projects move forward.
All right. Thank you again, everybody. And we'll let you know when the next educational forum is being planned. So we appreciate it. Stay informed, stay educated. And that's what I think is the best thing we could do for a hopeful future.